The work order said, Subsector 9 Bravo, Pipe Junction 44C, suspected thermal bleed from conduit stack. Priority 3. Estimated repair time, 2 hours. I was down there for 11 weeks. My name is Torvin Hask. I was, at the time, a maintenance-grade IV assigned to Relay Station under Brace, a subsurface supply depot buried in the bedrock of Dunn's Moon, which is a small, tidally locked rock orbiting a gas giant that nobody has ever written a poem about. I repaired pipes. I logged the repairs in triplicate. I argued with supply about requisition delays. I ate reconstituted soy protein 3 times a day and slept in a bunk the width of a door. And I was 46 years old and had long since made my peace with the fact that this was the shape of my life. It suited me. I am not a complicated man. I like things that either work or can be made to work. I like problems with solutions. I like it when I can write, at the bottom of a work order, the word resolved and mean it, and move on to the next thing. The child was not technically a pipe problem. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what Subsector 9 Bravo was, because it matters. 6 months before I found her, the quarantine authority sealed 3 entire subsectors of the depot's lower levels, 7 Alpha, 8 Charlie, and 9 Bravo, under an official biohazard designation level 4. They posted the stickers everywhere. Yellow, black borders, the authority's crest in the corner, the word contaminated in block letters large enough to read from 10 meters. They ran sealing foam along the main access hatches, changed the lock codes, and notified station administration that no personnel were to enter without a full biosuit and written authority clearance, which took a minimum of 14 working days to process. They were very thorough. I will give them that. The authority has always been thorough. It is what they are for, and they do it consistently, and I would have found them easier to work against if I'd respected them less. The official reason was Velhari hollow cough. The Velhari are a people, were a people with a functioning government, until the compact collapsed, and one of the things their children sometimes carry is a respiratory illness that looks, on standard atmospheric sensors, like a particularly aggressive bacterial bloom. The authority had guidelines. The guidelines said, any space where Velhari individuals have sheltered for more than 72 hours is to be treated as a potential hollow cough vector zone and sealed pending full decontamination. This was technically accurate. The Velhari had been sheltering in 9 Bravo. A dozen families, maybe more, had been living down there for nearly 3 months after the compact's main transport lines went dark, and they found themselves stranded on Dunn's Moon with nowhere to go and no government left to petition. The station's upper administration had looked the other way, which I respected, until the authority arrived and the upper administration abruptly developed a case of institutional memory loss about what was in their own basement. The Velhari were cleared out in a single night. I was asleep. I found out in the morning when I saw the stickers. I want to be clear about something. I did not in the morning make any decisions. I read the notification that went around to all station personnel. I read the official biohazard designation, and I went to work. What I thought privately is not relevant to anything that happened next. What a man thinks and what he does are different accounts, kept in different ledgers, and what matters is the one you can show to other people. 6 weeks passed. The pipe fault in junction 44C grew from a minor thermal anomaly on the sensors to something that was going to become a real problem if nobody looked at it. I submitted the work order. Priority 3. I went down with my kit on a Tuesday morning and let myself into the sealed sector with my maintenance override. A code I had, and the authority did not, because the authority's jurisdiction covered biohazard status, but the maintenance crew's codes covered physical access to the depot's infrastructure. And these two things had not been reconciled in the relevant administrative framework, which was an oversight that I intended to mention to nobody. I want to say that what happened next was not something I anticipated. That is true. I had thought about the Velhari families. I had not thought about the possibility that someone had been missed. What I did not know until 6 weeks later, not until I went down there myself for the pipe fault that was, in fact, a real pipe fault, was that the clearing out had not been entirely complete. One had been left behind. I found her in the pipe room. The pipe room in Junction 44C is not a large space. It's a maintenance alcove, really, about 3 meters wide and 4 deep, smelling permanently of hot metal and the particular dusty electric scent of overworked insulation. The walls are bare rock with conduit brackets bolted in at intervals, and the floor is grated metal over a drainage channel that runs somewhere toward the lower sumps. I'd been in there 100 times. I knew it like I knew my own bunk, the way the grating flexed under the left foot, the way the second from left conduit always ran 3 degrees hotter than its neighbors, the ticking sound the main line made when the pressure cycled. What I did not know was that there was a ventilation shaft behind the number 6 bracket that a small person could fit through. She was curled up behind conduit stack 44C between the pipe housing and the rock wall in a gap that I would not have thought a person could occupy. She was wrapped in a piece of thermal insulation blanket, the silver kind, industrial grade, the sort we kept in emergency supply boxes throughout the lower levels, and she had a small cloth doll tucked under her chin. The doll was handmade, yarn hair, button eyes, worn at the seams from being held for a long time by someone who held things when they needed to hold something. She was ashen copper in coloring, the way Velhari children are, a warm gray-brown that catches light oddly like old bronze. Her eyes, when they opened because she heard me come in, were pale silver from edge to edge, without visible iris or pupil in the ordinary sense, the way Velhari eyes are. She had black hair, very fine, tangled with her own fitful sleep. Along her jawline and down the side of her neck, there were small points of amber light, bioluminescent, barely visible in the overhead glow of the work lamps, the kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you weren't looking. I learned later it was a fear response. When a Velhari child is frightened, those markings pulse. They were pulsing very fast. She was also visibly sick. Even I could tell that. Her breathing was the wrong kind of labored, not the panicked, quick breathing of a scared child, which I would have expected and been less worried about, but the slow, effortful kind that meant the lungs were working harder than they should over a sustained period. Her lips had a grayish tint. When she looked at me, she didn't make a sound. She just held the doll tighter and watched me with those silver eyes and waited for whatever was going to happen to her. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went and looked at the pipe fault. It was, as I had suspected, a thermal bleed from the secondary coupling on 44C's main line. The insulation sleeve had cracked, probably from the temperature cycling that happened when the sector was sealed and the heating load redistributed, and the heat was bleeding out into the surrounding rock at a rate that would trigger the cascade alarm within 8 days. I estimated 4 hours of repair work. I had the parts in my kit. I got out my tools. She watched me the entire time. I worked on the pipe. She didn't move. I didn't speak to her. I was, at that point, doing a very careful kind of not thinking, the sort where you keep your hands busy and let your brain work the problem without acknowledging that you're working the problem, because if you acknowledge it, you have to make a decision, and I wasn't ready to make a decision yet. Every pipe mechanic knows this state. You're in the middle of a job, you've found a secondary problem that's bigger than the primary one, and you're holding both things in your head while your hands do the thing your hands know how to do, and when your hands are done, you'll look at the secondary problem clearly. Not before. The decision, stated plainly, was this. I had found a Velhari child in a sealed biohazard sector. The correct procedure was to notify the quarantine authority, who would come and collect her and process her under the Velhari displacement protocol, which meant a transit camp, which meant months or years of transit camp medicine. Which for a child with hollow cough, and she had it, I was reasonably sure. The sound of her breathing told me that much. meant she would probably not survive the year. That was the correct procedure. I fixed the pipe coupling. I pressure tested the new sleeve. I packed my tools. I filled out the repair section of my work tablet with careful attention to the pipe specifications and careful inattention to anything else. I noted the date, the repair time, the materials used. I logged it. Then I got my kit together, stood up, looked at the child and said, "Is there anyone else down here?" She stared at me. "Family, other people." "Nothing." "I'm asking," I said, "because I need to know whether this is a situation involving one person or multiple persons, because those are different kinds of problems and I'd prefer to understand the scope of the thing before I make any decisions. I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm a pipe mechanic. I came to fix the pipe. The pipe is fixed. Now I'm trying to work out what the rest of this looks like." She kept staring, then very slowly she shook her head. "Just the one then." I looked at my work tablet. I looked at the pipe I'd just fixed. I looked at the child behind it with the cloth doll and the amber light pulsing along her jaw and the slow, too effortful breathing. Then I opened a new work order on my tablet. Subsector 9 Bravo, Junction 44C and adjacent alcoves. Secondary inspection required, possible additional thermal bleed from rock face conduit brackets 3 through 9. Preliminary survey of ventilation routing to assess decontamination compliance. Estimated inspection time, ongoing. Status, in progress. I filed it, Priority 3. Nobody reads Priority 3 work orders until they become Priority 1, and by then it's already your problem, not theirs. "All right," I said to the child. "Stay here. Don't go near the main hatch. There's a sensor array on the far side of the hatch door and it reads heat signatures, and if it reads yours it will flag an alert, and then we have a different kind of problem. I'll be back." She looked at me. I don't know what she understood of that, probably not all of it, but she stayed, which was the relevant part. I came back 4 hours later with medical supplies I'd signed out under a different work order. Heating grid maintenance, Eastern Sector, requires biological contaminant testing kit for safety compliance, and a container of reconstituted broth that I'd told the galley was for a protein calibration test on a piece of equipment that I had invented on the spot, and would need to keep inventing, consistently, for as long as this situation lasted. The child was exactly where I'd left her. She watched me come in and set things down. She watched me open the medical kit. She watched me read the diagnostic instructions twice because I am a pipe mechanic, not a doctor, and I was aware of this limitation and intended to be rigorous about it. The scanner confirmed hollow cough, early to mid-stage, treatable if you had the right things, which I did not yet have but intended to obtain. I gave her the broth. She drank it carefully with both hands around the container, watching me over the rim. "I'll be back tomorrow," I said. "Don't go near the main hatch." I left. The right things were a specific class of respiratory antipathogens that were, in theory, available through Station Medical. But Station Medical was run by a man named Drossler who had the authorities' ear and a policy of careful record keeping, and I was not going to ask him for anything that might generate a record. What I did instead was file a requisition for general maintenance biohazard decontamination supplies. These were available through supply without medical's involvement, on the grounds that maintenance personnel sometimes had to work in contaminated areas and needed basic protective and remediation equipment. And spend an hour that evening cross-referencing the active compounds in standard decon supplies against the treatment protocols I'd found in an old Velhari medical text in the station's general reference library, which nobody had bothered to remove because nobody had thought anyone would bother to read it. There is a compound used in standard atmospheric decontamination, a respiratory scrubbing agent, grade 2, that is, in appropriate concentrations and via appropriate delivery, functionally equivalent to the first-line treatment for hollow cough in its early stages. The reason for this is not obscure. The compound was developed partly from Velhari medical research in the 2030s, which found its way into general industrial application after the compact's initial trade agreements opened their pharmaceutical archives, and the industrial formulation retained most of the therapeutic properties of the original, just at concentrations calibrated for atmosphere-scale application rather than individual treatment. You needed to dilute it substantially, and you needed to deliver it through something like an inhalation mask rather than an atmospheric dispersal system, and you needed to calculate the dosage by body mass rather than cubic meters of air, and none of this was documented anywhere in the industrial application materials. I figured it out from first principles and the Velhari medical text and 2 hours of arithmetic. I want to state again, I'm a pipe mechanic. I was doing this the way I do every job I don't know how to do, which is to read everything relevant, think carefully, check the math twice, and then do it. If this seems inadequate given the stakes, I was aware of that. I was also aware that the alternative was the transit camp and the hollow cough and the probability curve I'd already run, and the arithmetic on those numbers was considerably worse. The next morning I sat in the pipe room with my calculations and my kit and the child watching me from behind the conduit stack, and I said, I want to be honest with you. I'm not a doctor. I'm a pipe mechanic. I have read extensively about your illness in the last several hours, which is not the same thing as understanding it, and I am going to try to treat you with a substance that is technically a decontamination agent and not a medicine. And if this goes wrong, it's possible we'll both have a worse day than we're currently having. I want you to know that before I do anything. She looked at me for a long moment. I could see her thinking, not the blank look of a frightened child, but the actual deliberate process of assessment, weighing the information, deciding. It was the same expression she used later when she beat me at the card game, a quiet, methodical consideration. Then she held out her arm. I treated her for hollow cough over the following 3 weeks using decontamination requisitions, a reference text from 2031, and the specific kind of stubborn persistence that I have been told by multiple supervisors across my career is my least appealing quality. She improved, slowly and then less slowly, and then with the measurable steadiness of a thing that is working the way it is supposed to work. The labored breathing evened out. The gray tint left her lips. The amber markings along her jaw stopped pulsing constantly and started only lighting up when something startled her, which was the more normal resting state. I came down every day, sometimes twice, when the work orders justified it and I could arrange a reason to be in that sector. I brought food, always something I could account for with a false work order, always something I'd cross-referenced against Velhari dietary information in the same reference library that had proved so useful. Velhari have a mild intolerance for certain processed proteins, and their children need a higher proportion of certain minerals than human baseline children do, and these requirements are not catastrophically different from human dietary needs, but are different enough that simply feeding her what I ate would cause problems over time. I knew this because I'd read about it. I adjusted the requisitions accordingly. I invented increasingly elaborate equipment calibration tests to explain the nutrient requirements. My fictional equipment became progressively more complex, as fictional equipment tends to do when you need it to explain a growing set of needs. I brought water. I brought things to do, eventually, a maintenance manual I no longer needed, some spare fasteners she could sort by size, a deck of cards I'd found in a storage locker and had no use for myself. She sorted the fasteners with a thoroughness that reminded me of my own approach to parts inventory. She looked at the cards but seemed uncertain what to do with them. I showed her a simple game, matching pairs, nothing complicated, and she watched me deal the first hand with the focused attention of someone learning the rules of a new system. And then she beat me at it twice in a row on the third day, which suggested she was recovering faster than I'd expected and also had a better memory than I did. We didn't talk much. My Velhari is non-existent. Her standard, the lingua franca of the station, was minimal but growing because she was, I understood, learning it the way she learned everything, methodically and by observation. She watched my mouth when I spoke. She repeated words back to herself quietly, testing the sounds. Within 2 weeks she could follow most of what I said if I spoke at a reasonable pace and didn't use idiom, which I tried not to. And when she didn't understand something, she indicated this with a particular slight tilt of the head that I came to recognize as clearly as a spoken question. We communicated in the practical language of tasks and routines. I brought things, she received them, we established a rhythm. She knew the sound of my boots on the grating before I came through the door. She stopped flinching when I moved quickly. That, I considered, was progress. I learned her name by accident. I found it written, in the small, careful letters of a child practicing a new skill, on the inside cover of the maintenance manual. She'd borrowed a marker from my kit at some point without asking, which I noted for later discussion, and written KETH in letters that leaned slightly to the left, the way left-handed people's letters lean before they've been corrected out of it. "Keth," I said, the next time I came in. She looked up. "That's you." She nodded. "Right," I said, "I'm Torvin Hask." I pointed at myself. She said it back. Torven. The two syllables very even, like she was memorizing the shape of a new piece of equipment, establishing the sound in her mind at the place where things that needed to be remembered were stored. "Good enough," I said. This went on. The authority, meanwhile, was not idle. The quarantine authority on Dunn's Moon consisted of 3 permanent officers and a rotating support staff of 2, and they operated out of an office in the station's administrative block with a great deal of yellow signage, and a fondness for procedure that I recognized as a professional temperament, even if I was currently working against it. They conducted regular perimeter checks of the sealed subsectors, twice weekly, logged in the shared station maintenance database which I had read access to as part of my job. They ran atmospheric tests from the main access hatches. They periodically asked station administration for updates on the decontamination timeline, and station administration provided responses calibrated to be simultaneously reassuring and non-binding, which is a specific administrative skill that I had not previously appreciated. The atmospheric tests were my primary concern. The Velhari bioluminescence is faint, but Velhari biology has a specific metabolic signature that shows up on standard biological scanners if the scanner is pointed in the right direction. The hollow cough treatment I was using produced a secondary compound as a metabolic byproduct that would also flag a bioscan, mildly, as a possible contamination indicator, which was almost useful, since an active hollow cough biohazard signal was exactly what the authority would expect to see in a sealed biohazard sector, and might explain the readings without raising questions about their source. Almost useful is not the same as safe, however, and I spent a significant amount of time ensuring that the thermal signature from Keth's body heat and the compound traces from her treatment remained below the threshold that would prompt the authority to investigate further rather than simply log the readings as consistent with the established biohazard status and move on. I accomplished this partly through the manipulation of the sector's ventilation routing, a legitimate maintenance function, entirely within my remit, justified by a work order citing thermal regulation concerns in the eastern heating grid, and partly through the strategic placement of a malfunctioning thermal bleed unit from my parts inventory in a corner of the sector that I was quite sure the authority scanners would point at first, because it was the closest corner to the main access hatch. An authority personnel conducting exterior atmospheric scans without entering the sector would start with the nearest readings. A malfunctioning thermal bleed unit produces exactly the kind of messy, low-level biosignature that a half-decontaminated biohazard sector would produce naturally. It took me about 40 minutes to set it up and file the maintenance note. I logged it as scheduled for repair, low priority. It was, technically, scheduled for repair. I just hadn't specified a date. I became very good at low-priority work orders during those weeks. They are, I discovered, the most useful administrative tool available to a maintenance mechanic engaged in long-term unauthorized child concealment, because nothing about maintenance ever seems urgent to anyone except the mechanic. And as long as the heating grid stays warm and the water runs clean and the lights stay on, the contents of a low-priority work order might as well be written in a language nobody reads. Which, in a sense, they are. I had been filing low-priority work orders for 16 years, and nobody had ever read one closely. I was now relying on that habit of inattention the way I relied on a load-bearing pipe, quietly, and with the specific dread of a man who knows what happens if the thing fails. The second major challenge after the atmospheric scans was food supply. I could requisition small amounts of food-adjacent items, calibration solutions, protein matrix test stocks, nutrient suspension fluid for equipment use, without anyone looking closely at the quantities, provided the quantities remained small and the work orders were sufficiently plausible. This required creativity. I became, over the course of those weeks, moderately expert in inventing pieces of equipment that required nutrition-adjacent supplies for their operation, and in writing work orders for those supplies in language that suggested the equipment existed and was important, and that only I understood its requirements. My supervisor, a man named Helwick, who I mention only to say he is a decent man who reads his work queue with admirable efficiency and no curiosity whatsoever, approved every single one without comment. Keth ate reconstituted soy protein and nutrient bars, and occasionally, a soft grain porridge that I told Helwick was required for a viscosity calibration test on the thermal sensors in the lower grid, which makes no sense as a sentence but which Helwick approved because it contained the words thermal sensors and lower grid, and that was apparently sufficient. She was not enthusiastic about the soy protein. She ate it with the focused practicality of someone who understood that food was fuel and sentiment about fuel was a luxury. I respected this. I had been eating reconstituted soy protein without enthusiasm for 16 years and had come to much the same position. By the 4th week, she was well enough to move around the pipe room freely, and by the 5th week, she had worked out that the ventilation shaft behind bracket 6 connected to 2 other alcoves further along the 44C corridor, which she had thoroughly explored without telling me. I found out when I arrived one morning to find her sitting in the middle of the pipe room with a collection of items she'd assembled from those alcoves: 3 spare O-rings, a length of copper tubing, a pressure gauge with a cracked face, and a small relay component of a type I hadn't used since a retrofit job 3 years ago. She had arranged them in a careful row by size. I looked at the items, I looked at her. "Where did you get the relay component?" She pointed at the vent shaft. "Those alcoves are sealed." She pointed at the vent shaft again with the patient expression of someone explaining a self-evident fact to a slow learner. It was, clearly, only sealed to people who couldn't fit through a 30-centimeter gap. "The relay component is actually useful," I said after a moment. "I'll put it in my kit. The rest of this, put it back where you found it, because if someone runs an inventory check and finds things missing, it generates a query, and queries get looked at, and the last thing we need right now is something that gets looked at." She considered this, then looked at the O-rings. "Yes, you can keep the O-rings," I said. "They're not on tracked inventory. Nobody counts O-rings." I paused. "What do you want O-rings for?" She looked at them, then she shrugged. "All right," I said. She kept the O-rings. She used them, over the subsequent weeks, to build an increasingly elaborate organizational system for the items in the pipe room, sorted by size, type, and what I can only describe as her own proprietary classification that I never entirely decoded. The pipe room, by the 6th week, was more organized than it had been at any point in my tenure at Underbrace. I did not mention this in my work logs. It seemed like the kind of thing that would raise questions. There were harder days. There was a day in the third week when the hollow cough hit back before the treatment fully took hold. She woke from sleep coughing, the wrong kind, the labored lung-deep kind, and I sat in the pipe room in the dimmed work lights with my back against the conduit stack and listened to it and did the math again for the fourth time and came to the same answer I'd always come to. Not transit camp. Not authority processing. This. I had made the decision. The decision didn't change because the difficulty of it became more visible. I stayed until the cough passed and she was breathing easier, and then I went back up and filed a work order for additional ventilation maintenance in the 44C corridor and went to bed. There was a day when the authority ran an unscheduled sweep. Not just the perimeter check but a full corridor atmospheric pass, officers in biosuits with active scanners, moving through the sector's accessible spaces outside the sealed hatches. They couldn't enter without their Level 4 clearance process, which took 14 working days, but they could scan from outside. I was 3 levels up, in my office, going through the maintenance database in real time, watching the scan flags appear and resolve. The malfunctioning thermal bleed unit flagged. 2 conduit brackets with residual heat signatures flagged. The biological contamination indicator in the sector's general atmosphere flagged at the expected level, consistent with a sealed hollow cough zone undergoing natural decontamination, and was logged as normal decay. Nothing else flagged. I drank my tea and went back to the work queue. There was a day when Keth sat very still and watched me working on a valve housing with an expression I couldn't read, and then said, in standard, with obvious effort, family. Gone. I kept working on the valve housing. I said, yes, but not the forever kind of gone. The authority swept the sector. They'd have been taken to a transit facility. That's different from gone. She looked at the doll in her lap. The amber markings on her jaw were very quiet, barely a flicker. I know it doesn't feel different, I said. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't feel different, but it is, and that matters. She didn't say anything else. I finished the valve housing. We played cards for a while. She beat me. I had been letting her win in the early weeks, which was a pedagogical decision and not sentiment, but by that point she was beating me without my assistance, and I had stopped letting her win because it seemed patronizing, and she was winning anyway, which told me her memory for the card positions was substantially better than mine. I mentioned this observation. She looked at me with the expression she used when I said something she considered self-evident. The weeks move the way weeks do when you're doing something quietly difficult, very slowly in the moment and very fast in retrospect. My work orders accumulated. My requisitions accumulated. The low-priority jobs in the 44C corridor accumulated into a coherent fiction of a maintenance project that had been going on for a long time and would, by implication, continue going on for a long time without anyone needing to look closely at the details. By the 7th week, Keth had enough standard to hold a limited conversation. She had learned it with the same methodical patience she brought to everything. The cards, the O-rings, the way she listened to the ticking of the 44C main line, and had, at some point, worked out from observation alone which ticking pattern meant the pressure was cycling normally, and which meant it was running high. She knew the pipe room the way I'd known it before I'd found her in it, and then she knew it better than I did, because she'd been in it for weeks while I'd only been visiting, and familiarity built over weeks of solitary occupation is a different thing from familiarity built over years of passing through. The conversations were short and practical by necessity and also by temperament. Hers and mine were not dissimilar in that regard, which I noticed without comment. She asked about the pipes, sometimes, and I answered. She asked about the station, the authority, the broader situation with the compact, and I answered those too, as honestly as I could at a level that wouldn't overwhelm a child still learning the language I was answering in. She told me in pieces, things about the compact that I half knew from general knowledge and had not thought carefully about, the settlement programs, the transit routes, The way the collapse had severed the roots first so that the settlements were stranded before the government was officially declared dissolved. It happened fast, she told me, in the particular careful standard of someone translating from a language with more words for this thing than the language they were translating into. Fast and quiet, and then it was done. I listened. I didn't offer commentary because commentary wasn't what was needed. There was a night. I didn't usually come at night, but there was a pressure spike in the 44C main line that I needed to check in person because my logged reason for being in the sector involved thermal monitoring, and if the thermal readings didn't reflect the check, the log was inconsistent. When I came in and she was awake in the dark, sitting with her back against the conduit housing, not doing anything, just sitting. The amber markings were faintly lit, steady and slow. I checked the pressure. It was fine. I sat down on my side of the room because leaving immediately would have felt like the wrong thing, and I had learned to trust my sense of what the wrong thing was in that room. We sat in the dark together for a while, the pipe ticking through its cycle, the distant vibration of the station systems in the rock around us. Eventually she fell asleep. I stayed until her breathing was even and her jaw markings had gone dark, and then I logged the pressure check and went back up. I did not include that in any work order. One morning she told me her parents had been taken in the sweep while she was asleep in the vent shaft. She had hidden there by instinct. She had been hiding in the vent shaft periodically since before I found her, she explained, because when the adults talked at night, they talked about the possibility of a sweep, and she had worked out from those conversations that the vent shaft was too small for authority personnel in biosuits to enter. She had heard them go. She had stayed in the shaft until she was sure. Then she had come back out and waited. For who? I asked. She shrugged. A small, deliberate shrug, the kind that means I knew the honest answer was probably nobody, but I waited anyway. Someone, she said. I didn't say anything to that. It was around the 8th week that I started thinking seriously about what the end of this looked like. Not the bad end. I had a clear picture of the bad end, involving a flag on an authority scan and a very unpleasant conversation, and outcomes I preferred not to dwell on. The good end. The one where this resolved in a way that meant Keth was somewhere safe, and her lungs continued to work properly, and the adults in her life included at least some who were better qualified than me. The Velhari community, such as it still existed on Dun's moon, had been scattered, but communities don't scatter completely. There are always threads. I knew this the way I knew that a pipe that had been patched in one place was under pressure somewhere else. The force doesn't disappear, it moves. Someone in that community would still be present, still be functional, still be the kind of person who kept track of where the children were. There is always someone like that. I started carefully looking. I did not do this in any way that could be traced to a search for Velhari individuals, because that was the obvious thread to pull, and I had not survived 8 weeks of unauthorized child concealment by pulling obvious threads. I did it laterally, the way you find a leak in a sealed system, by looking at everything adjacent to the thing you're looking for. Transit logs, supply manifests, the subtle patterns in which station areas received certain kinds of supply requisitions. Velhari have dietary needs that differ slightly from human baseline, and those needs, in a community maintaining itself covertly, show up as small anomalies in supply records if you know what you're looking for. Small enough to ignore unless you're looking. I was looking. It took me 11 days. I found a name not directly, but through the supply record method, attached to a work roster in the station's civilian labor sector. A Velhari woman listed as a laundry auxiliary, which was the kind of job that involves being invisible all day in a place where people bring things that need to be cleaned and take them away again, which is why you take it when you need to be present but not visible. I had no way to contact her directly without creating a record, and I was not going to create a record. What I did instead was file a maintenance work order for the laundry auxiliary sector. A genuine fault, as it happened, a pressure imbalance in the hot water feed line that had been on my queue for 2 weeks, and go and fix it in person, which was slightly below my current grade level but not unusually so when the queue was long and the lower grade staff were occupied. She was working when I arrived. I fixed the pipe. She did not speak to me and I did not speak to her. We were in that space, two maintenance-adjacent people going about their work, which is exactly what it looked like and also exactly what it was. When I left my work tablet on the edge of the sorting table, which appeared to be an oversight, and went back for it 15 minutes later, which is normal behavior for a man who forgets his tablet. When I came back for it, there was a 6-digit code written on the back in laundry marker. Small, careful letters. I don't know what it cost her to write it. I know she'd have known what it meant, that there was a child somewhere who needed to move. I know she'd have done the same risk calculation I had done and come to the same conclusion and written it anyway. I know she was one of 3 people in the station's civilian population who had been quietly maintaining an informal network since the sweep, finding out where the families had gone, keeping track, waiting for the right moment and the right contact. The code was a comm frequency, off the station's main network, running through a maintenance relay I had access to. That evening, I added a routing note to one of my ongoing work orders and left a 60-second window in the relay's maintenance schedule, which was a legitimate adjustment. The relay had been running slightly hot, and a maintenance window was appropriate, and within which a burst transmission handshake could be completed. 60 seconds is enough if you're not sending much. In the morning, the relay showed a brief maintenance spike, duration 58 seconds, logged as normal fluctuation in the maintenance database. 3 days later, a second spike, 42 seconds. Enough. 3 days after that, I came down to the pipe room and told Keth that there were people in the station who were going to help her move. That they had a route. That the route was not fast. These things are never fast. The networks are cautious. The timing has to be right, but it was real, and it was being arranged. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "You?" "No," I said. "I'm a pipe mechanic. I'm not equipped for whatever comes next." I paused. What comes next requires different skills than I have. The people with those skills are working on it. My job is to keep you here until it's ready. She looked at the doll in her lap. She looked at the relay component on the shelf in my kit, the one from the alcove, the one she'd given me, which I'd used in 3 actual repair jobs since she'd found it. Then she looked back at me with an expression that took me a moment to identify, because it was not an expression I associated with her face. It was, I thought, something in the neighborhood of relief. Not the collapse of relief, the way frightened people sometimes fall apart when the pressure lets off. The quieter kind. The kind that knows the hard part isn't over but can acknowledge, briefly, that the shape of the hard part is now known. "How long?" she said. 2 weeks probably, maybe 3. She nodded. She had the quality, I had noticed this early, before I'd known her well enough to name it, of receiving difficult information with a stillness that was not resignation. Resignation collapses inward. Her stillness was different. It held its shape. It was, I thought, what competence looks like in a child who has been required to be competent too early and has become it anyway. The 2 weeks were the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong, which meant I spent the entire period waiting for something to go wrong, which is its own kind of work. The authority announced a full sector review, a formal audit of all sealed subsectors, including 9 Bravo, to assess readiness for a decontamination contract. The audit meant a senior officer reviewing the maintenance logs for all activity in the sealed sectors. My maintenance logs for 9 Bravo were, to put it gently, extensive. The thermal bleed repairs, the ventilation rerouting, the bracket inspection series, the ongoing atmospheric verification readings I'd been running as part of a decontamination compliance documentation set I had invented, the malfunctioning thermal bleed unit, still logged as scheduled for repair at unspecified future date. 43 work orders, all legitimate in their paperwork, all pointing toward the same alcove in the same corridor for anyone who was determined to follow the direction they were pointing. The senior officer was a woman named Vost, and she read the logs because she sent me a query. Why had I logged thermal variance readings for the alcoves off junction 44C rather than using the sector's automated sensors, which were rated for continued operation in a sealed biohazard environment? I responded. The automated sensors had been flagging false positives during the early decontamination period, generating spurious authority response triggers. I had manually verified the readings to establish a clean baseline and avoid unnecessary response deployments, as I had observed happened in 7 Alpha and 8 Charlie under similar automated sensor conditions. I cited both instances by date and deployment record. I noted that my manual readings were consistent with normal biohazard decay, and that I was prepared to provide calibration records for the manual instruments used. She did not ask for the calibration records. I provided them anyway, in full, unsolicited, with a cover note explaining that I was including them for completeness, since the audit might benefit from the full documentation set. The calibration records were genuine. I had, in fact, been calibrating my manual instruments carefully throughout, partly because accurate readings were necessary for what I was doing, and partly because accurate calibration records are what an innocent man doing ordinary maintenance work would have. She logged the audit as complete. Sector 9 Bravo, maintenance activity within parameters, no anomalies requiring further review. I logged her audit response into my work file under the heading Compliance Documentation Filed and Approved. Resolved. 11 days after that, Keth left. I want to say this plainly because it was plainly what happened. She left, and I watched her go, and that was the correct outcome of the 11 weeks prior. I knew it was correct. I had been working toward it from the moment I opened that second work order in Junction 44C. It was what I intended when I found her behind the conduit stack with her thermal blanket and her doll and her lungs working harder than they should. And it was what every subsequent work order and false requisition and relay timing calculation had been in service of. Knowing the thing is right does not change how it goes when it happens. The contact came through the maintenance relay at 03:40 station time when the sector was quiet. I was already in the pipe room. I told Keth the day before, and she'd spent the evening sitting in the middle of the floor with the cloth doll, not sorting fasteners, not playing cards, just sitting in the way she sat when she was processing something large. I'd sat on the other side of the room and not said anything, which was what was required. We had been in the pipe room together, between the two of us, enough times that silence did not need explanation. At 03:40 I got the relay signal and I said, "It's time." She stood up. She had become a different child than the one I'd found. Not a grown child. She was still small, still young, still with the amber markings and the silver eyes and the fine black hair. But her lungs worked properly. Her hands were steady. She moved through the pipe room the way she'd moved through it for weeks, sure of the floor, aware of the conduits, her feet knowing every grating flex and bracket shadow. She had memorized it completely, the way you memorize the spaces you've lived in rather than the spaces you've passed through. She picked up the cloth doll. She went to the vent shaft behind bracket 6. Then she stopped and turned and came back across the room and held the doll out to me. I looked at it. I said, "That's yours." She shook her head. I looked at the doll for a moment longer. The yarn hair, the button eyes, the seams worn from a long time of being held by someone who needed something to hold. Then I took it. I am not a sentimental person by nature or by practice, and I want to be precise about what I was and was not feeling in that moment. I was not feeling something large and dramatic. I was feeling the specific weight of a small handmade cloth doll, which is very light, and the specific weight of what that object had been to someone during a difficult period, which is not light at all, and the gap between those two weights, which is where most of the things that matter lie. I said, "All right." She went back to the vent shaft. She fit through it the way she always had, easily, efficiently, without wasted motion. She looked back once from the other side of the bracket. The amber markings on her jaw were completely still. Her eyes were silver and entirely calm. Then she was gone. I stood in the pipe room for a while. Then I got out my work tablet and logged the last entry in my 44C file. Junction 44C, thermal inspection complete, all readings within normal parameters. Bracket survey concluded. Sector cleared for standard maintenance rotation. No further priority 3 monitoring required. I filed it. I went to bed. The next morning I came to work. I fixed a pressure valve in the eastern dormitory sector. I argued with supply about a requisition delay for parts that had been on order for 3 weeks. I ate reconstituted soy protein for breakfast. Helwig stopped me in the corridor and asked how the 44C project was going, and I said it was wrapped up, all readings clear, no further issues expected. Good, he said, and moved on. I kept the cloth doll in my kit for the rest of my time on Dunn's Moon, not on display. In the inner pocket where I kept the small tools I used most, the calibration probe, the pocket torch, the pipe gauge I'd had since my 2nd year as a grade II. It was there when I did the pressure valve. It was there when I rerouted the ventilation feeds in 7 alpha 6 months later, during the actual formal decontamination project, the legitimate one, when the authority had finally satisfied themselves that the sector was ready for re-entry, and I was asked to assess the maintenance backlog. I found the malfunctioning thermal bleed unit where I'd left it. I picked it up, turned it over, noted the condition. It had done what I needed it to do. I logged it for disposal. I transferred off Dunn's Moon 14 months later. Grade IV to grade III, a promotion to the outer ring of the maintenance hierarchy, a new posting at a logistics hub with better equipment and worse food. I left the contaminated sticker on the door of the pipe room in Junction 44C, I don't know why. It seemed right to leave something that was, at this point, technically accurate in the most useless possible way. The room had been contaminated, in a sense, by 11 weeks of unauthorized maintenance work and 1 child and a cloth doll and more O-rings than anyone could explain. And also right to leave the kind of thing that looked like a thing left behind by accident, which is to say, like nothing at all. I took the doll. I took the relay component she had found and given me, which I had used in 3 jobs and kept meaning to return to inventory, and somehow never had. I carried them to 3 more stations after Dunn's Moon, in the way that you carry things that don't weigh enough to justify leaving behind, and that you therefore never leave behind. 14 years after the pipe room, 14 years, 2 additional grade promotions, a retirement posting at a quiet logistics hub on the outer rim of a system nobody thought much about, my sister's farm 10 minutes away, which I visited on days off because she kept chickens, and I found chickens to be excellent company. I was sitting on the front step of the maintenance shed in the early evening, drinking tea, watching the long shadows come across the landing flat as the binary set in the west, when a transport shuttle came in on the daily cargo run, and a young woman came down the ramp. She had ashen copper skin, silver eyes, fine black hair. She walked the way people who have learned to move through difficult spaces walk, economically, no wasted motion, fully present in the ground under her feet, the way you walk when you learned, very young, to know where the grating flexes. Along her jaw there were faint amber markings, still, fully at rest. She was wearing the uniform of the Velhari Compact Restoration Corps, the successor body to the old Compact, which had been reconstituting for the past 6 years in the careful way that things reconstitute when the people doing it have learned to work with what they have and not count on anything more. Field medic insignia on the collar. The kind of wear on the uniform that came from actual field work. Scuff on the left knee, patch on the right shoulder, the specific fatting at the cuffs that comes from washing something too many times in water that is never quite the right temperature. She crossed the landing flat and came up to me and stopped. She was taller than I'd expected. That is a foolish thing to say. Of course she was taller. It had been 14 years. She had been a child and she was not a child now, but knowing the math doesn't prepare you for the fact of it. Things don't stay small. They grow into what they're going to be, and you only see the gap when you're looking at both versions at once, and the gap is 23 years old and looking back at you. We looked at each other for a moment. Neither of us said anything. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small yellow square with black borders and the authorities' crest in the corner. The contaminated sticker from the door of the pipe room in Junction 44C, Subsector 9 Bravo, relay station under brace, Dunn's Moon. She'd gone back for it. At some point, I learned later it was 8 years after the pipe room, on a compact restoration survey visit to Dunn's Moon, she'd gone back to that corridor, found the door and taken the sticker off the wall. She'd been carrying it since then. 6 years. She held it out. I took it. I looked at it. It was exactly what it had always been. A bureaucratic warning label, official issue, printed in bulk by the thousands, applied by authorized personnel to indicate a biohazard zone, and peeled off a door in a sealed sector of a supply depot on a tidally locked moon that nobody had ever written a poem about. I folded it in half and put it in my shirt pocket. "Kath," I said. "Torven." The same 2 syllables, the same even weight, exactly as she'd said it the first time in the pipe room, learning the shape of a piece of equipment she intended to remember. I got up and went inside and made a second cup of tea. We sat on the front step and watched the shadows finish crossing the landing flat, and the chickens from my sister's farm making their evening rounds along the fence line the way they always did when the light dropped, and the last of the day's cargo being unloaded by the shuttle crew, box by box, unhurried. I still have the sticker. It is in the same pocket of my kit where the doll lived for 14 years, the doll she reclaimed when she arrived, having apparently carried the information about where it was across the same 14 years she'd carried the sticker and taken it back with the calm authority of someone collecting a thing that had always been hers. I'd offered it. She'd taken it. She'd looked at the relay component in my kit for a long moment. I'd offered that too. She'd said no. She said it had been doing more useful work where it was, which was a fair assessment of its history. We talked for 2 hours that evening. Not about the pipe room, not directly. It was there in the room the way load-bearing structures are there, present and understood and not requiring discussion. We talked about the compact restoration work, what it looked like from inside, what the actual conditions were in the transit facilities, what the medical needs were, and what the Corps was doing about them. We talked about Dunn's Moon and the station, and what had happened to various people she had encountered since. She asked about the work. I told her about the work. We were, the 2 of us, people who talked about work because work was the language we both had in common, and because the things that didn't need to be said didn't need to be said. At some point, she told me her parents had been in a transit facility in the outer ring for 3 years after the sweep, which I had known was possible, and had not let myself think about too carefully during the 11 weeks. They were living on one of the compact resettlement stations now, had been for 6 years. Her mother was on the Restoration Council for the Eastern Routes. Her father ran logistics for 3 of the resettlement programs, which I found, privately, satisfying in a way I did not explain. She left on the morning shuttle. Some things you can't account for in a work order. I have tried, across 20 years of thinking about this, to find the work order language for what happened in that pipe room, and I've never quite managed it. The closest I've gotten is this. A problem presented itself, and I assessed it, and I had the tools, and I used them. The problem was solved. The solution held. That is, in the end, what the job is. The official record for Subsector 9 Bravo, Junction 44C and adjacent alcoves, relay station under brace, Dunn's Moon, lists 11 weeks of Priority 3 maintenance work, thermal bleed repairs, ventilation rerouting, bracket inspection, ongoing atmospheric monitoring, compliance documentation reviewed and approved. The records are accurate as far as they go. They don't go very far, but they go far enough.